Nashville, 1976. Willie Nelson sits in a jail cell after being caught with marijuana. The phone rings. It's Waylon Jennings, offering to pay his bail. But when Waylon arrives at the station, he doesn't just pay, he walks straight into the cell and sits down next to Willie. "If he's staying, I'm staying," Waylon declares. That's country music's version of friendship. While the glitz and glamour of Nashville often steal the spotlight, it's the unshakable bonds formed in its darkest corners that truly define this genre's soul.
Before they were legends, they were outsiders. Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings first crossed paths in a dim-lit Phoenix bar in 1964. Both were struggling artists, frustrated by the rigid Nashville system that tried to polish their rough edges. That night, they made a pact over whiskey. They'd either make it their way, or they wouldn't make it at all. The friendship that would reshape country music started in the most unlikely way. Willie had just fled Nashville after his pig farm burned down, a disaster that he took as a sign to abandon the clean-cut Nashville sound. Waylon was playing regular gigs at JD's, a rowdy club where he'd developed his signature sound, something too raw for Music Row's taste. When Willie walked in that night, Waylon was in the middle of four walls, singing it with a defiant edge that Nashville would have never allowed. Willie joined him on stage without invitation, adding his distinctive guitar style to the mix. Instead of getting angry, Waylon just grinned and followed Willie's lead. Their early performances together became legendary in Phoenix's underground scene. They'd trade off songs until sunrise, mixing country with rock and blues in ways that scandalized traditional country fans. Record executives would show up drawn by the buzz, only to leave shaking their heads. Too rock for country, too country for rock became their common criticism, but the crowds kept growing. In 1966, they attempted their first recording session together at RCA's Nashville studio. The producers wanted them to use the A-Team session musicians, but Willie and Waylon insisted on using their own band. The resulting argument ended with both men walking out, leaving behind what would have been their first duet album. The tapes from that session, known as the Lost Phoenix Sessions, remained unreleased for decades. Their early years together were marked by shared struggles. Both men had record deals that stifled their creativity. Willie was forced to wear suits and sing with string arrangements that buried his unique timing. Waylon battled producers who wanted to turn him into another Ray Price clone. They found refuge at Tootsie's Orchid Lounge, spending countless nights plotting their musical revolution between sets. It was during one of these sessions that they first conceptualized the outlaw movement, though they didn't have a name for it yet. The turning point came in 1970. Willie's house in Tennessee caught fire, and he didn't call the fire department first. He called Waylon. Together, they managed to save Willie's beloved guitar trigger and, as the story goes, a pound of marijuana. Waylon would later joke that Willie's priorities that night told you everything you needed to know about the man. But what many don't know is that Waylon then spent 3 weeks helping Willie sort through the ashes, salvaging what they could of his master tapes and vintage guitar collection. During those weeks, they wrote some of their most defiant songs, including Me and Paul and Ladies Love Outlaws. The friendship faced its greatest test in 1977 when Waylon's cocaine addiction spiraled out of control. He was spending $1,500 a day on cocaine, and the same record companies they'd fought against were now betting on when he'd break. Willie didn't just offer help, he moved into Waylon's house for 2 months. They'd stay up all night, playing chess and writing songs, anything to keep Waylon's mind off cocaine. During one of these late-night sessions, around 3 a.m., they wrote Good-Hearted Woman. Waylon was talking about his wife, Jessie Coulter, describing how she put up with his wild ways. Willie grabbed a napkin and started turning those words into lyrics. By sunrise, they had a hit song that would define their sound, raw, honest, and defiantly personal. Their rebellion against the Nashville establishment reached its peak with the Outlaws album. The project started as a joke. They decided to embrace the Outlaw label that frustrated producers had given them. RCA initially refused to release it, claiming it would destroy country music's clean image. Willie and Waylon responded by organizing a free concert outside the RCA building, playing the unreleased songs for thousands of fans who showed up. The publicity forced RCA's hand, and what began as defiance turned into revolution. The album became country music's first platinum record, proving that authenticity could sell better than conformity. The depth of their friendship showed in the small moments too. In 1979, when Willie was going through his divorce from Connie Kopka, Waylon canceled scheduled an entire month of sold-out shows to be there for his friend. They spent that time on Willie's ranch in Texas, fishing and writing songs that would never see the light of day. Many of these songs were too personal to record, but one conversation led to Write Your Own Songs, their scathing reply to record executives who kept trying to change their style. Their bond extended beyond just the two of them, creating a support system for other artists fighting the system. When Merle Haggard was struggling with his own addiction issues in 1978, Willie and Waylon brought him out on tour, creating a safe environment where he could perform without temptation. They called it the Survivors Tour, though few understood the name's true meaning. They did the same for Johnny Cash during his recovery in 1983, giving him a stage when many others considered him a liability. The duo's influence reshaped Nashville's power structure. They started their own publishing company, Baron Music, specifically to help songwriters keep their creative rights. When upcoming artists like Jerry Jeff Walker and Billy Joe Shaver couldn't get record deals, Willie and Waylon would feature them on their albums, sharing both royalties and spotlight. This created what became known as the Austin Underground Railroad, a network of artists helping other artists escape Nashville's creative constraints. Their recording sessions became legendary for their unpredictability. During the Luckenbach, Texas session in 1977, they recorded for 37 straight hours, fueled by determination and Willie's special brownies. The song almost didn't make the album until Jesse Coulter heard it and convinced them it would be a hit. It topped the charts for 6 weeks, becoming their biggest duet success. Perhaps the most telling story comes from 1985, when the IRS came after Willie for $32 million in back taxes. Without hesitation, Waylon offered to sell his own publishing rights to help pay the debt. Willie refused, but the gesture cemented their bond forever. Instead, Waylon organized a series of benefit concerts, calling in favors from every artist they'd ever helped. The shows raised over $3.6 million, demonstrating the strength of the community they'd built. Through the late 80s and 90s, as country music shifted toward a more polished sound, Willie and Waylon remained each other's strongest defenders. When critics claimed they were outdated, they responded by forming the Highwaymen with Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson, creating yet another platinum album. At every show, they'd perform Good-Hearted Woman, their first duet hit, as a reminder of where they started. The friendship weathered every storm until Waylon's death in 2002. At the funeral, Willie played that same song one last time, changing the lyrics to "She's a good-hearted woman in love with a good timing man who's now in heaven's band." Their 4-decade partnership had changed country music forever, proving that true friendship could not only survive success, but make it sweeter. But while Willie and Waylon fought the system together, another legend was fighting a battle of her own. In fact, the same year the Outlaws album topped the charts, Dolly Parton was writing a song that would become one of the most famous goodbye letters in music history. Unlike the Outlaws' instant brotherhood, this friendship would start with 7 years of tension. Like when young Dolly Parton joined Porter Wagoner's show in 1967, the applause was drowned out by boos. Fans were still mourning the departure of his previous singing partner, Pretty Miss Norma Jean, and this flashy, unknown 21-year-old wasn't who they wanted to see. Porter himself had doubts, but something about Dolly's unwavering confidence made him take the biggest gamble of his career. The first few months were a masterclass in perseverance. Porter's audiences weren't just cold, they were hostile. "Where's Norma Jean?" they'd shout while Dolly performed. Some even walked out during her solos. But Porter did something unexpected. Instead of replacing her, he stood beside her night after night, his trademark nudie suit gleaming under the lights as he told audiences, "Give this girl a chance." What the audience didn't see were the hours Porter spent coaching Dolly, helping her understand television angles, teaching her to connect with cameras, and fine-tuning her stage presence. Behind the scenes, their relationship was complex from the start. Porter was a perfectionist who controlled every aspect of his show with military precision. He chose Dolly's songs, arranged her harmonies, and even suggested changes to her already iconic look. "More rhinestones," he'd say. "We need to out-sparkle the stage lights." He saw potential in her that others missed, but his controlling nature often crossed lines that would later strain their relationship. Their partnership revolutionized country music television. The Porter Wagoner Show reached 45 million viewers weekly, and Dolly's presence helped attract a younger audience. Their duets became legendary, with songs like "The Last Thing on My Mind" and "Making Plans" showcasing their perfect harmony blend. Off camera though, tension simmered. Porter would rage if Dolly spoke to other producers, fearing she'd leave. She'd counter by writing songs in secret, building a catalog of material he couldn't control. The power struggle intensified as Dolly's star rose. In 1973, Jolene hit the charts, and suddenly Dolly was getting more fan mail than Porter. Their arguments became as famous as their duets. One night in Kansas City, they fought so badly over a song arrangement that Porter threw a chair across the dressing room. 10 minutes later, they were on stage, smiling and singing in perfect harmony. This pattern repeated itself across 1,000 stages. What many don't know is that during these years, Porter was also Dolly's fiercest defender. When record executives suggested she needed to lose weight, Porter threatened to pull their sponsorship deals. When radio stations hesitated to play her solo singles, he personally called in favors to get her airplay. He was both her biggest supporter and her biggest obstacle, a contradiction that would define their relationship for decades. The truth about "I Will Always Love You" goes deeper than most realize. The song wasn't just a goodbye, it was a peace offering written in tears at 3 a.m. Porter had given her a start, but his controlling nature had become suffocating. That night, Dolly drove to Porter's office, found him still working, and played him the song. The second verse, Porter would later recall, hit me like a freight train. They both ended up crying, understanding that their professional relationship had to end for their friendship to survive. The split wasn't clean. Porter sued Dolly for breach of contract, demanding $3 million in compensation. But what happened next revealed the true nature of their bond. Rather than fight in court, Dolly asked for a private meeting. She brought every song they'd ever recorded together, plus a stack of unreleased duets. "These are yours," she said, signing over partial rights to her own compositions. Porter dropped the lawsuit the next day. The following years tested their relationship in unexpected ways. Porter's star began to fade while Dolly's soared. By 1979, he was struggling to fill small venues while she was selling out arenas. Depression and financial troubles hit him hard. What few people know is that during this time, Dolly secretly paid his band members' salaries, ensuring they wouldn't leave him. When asked why, she simply said, "Loyalty isn't just for the good times." Then came the darkest period. When Porter faced bankruptcy in the early 80s, Dolly didn't just help, she orchestrated a complete rescue. She bought his entire song catalog through a third party to avoid embarrassing him, but instead of keeping it, she gave it back to him when he got back on his feet. "He gave me my start," she said. "I owed him my loyalty." This gesture transformed their relationship from former partners to family. Their reconciliation became public in 1988 when they reunited to record Making Plans. The session was supposed to take one day. They stayed for a week, recording enough material for 2 albums. The project won them a Grammy, but more importantly, it helped Porter regain his standing in Nashville. Dolly used her star power to remind the industry of his contributions, often calling him the master in interviews. But it was in 2007, as Porter lay dying, that their story came full circle. Dolly canceled a European tour to be by his bedside. For hours, she sat with him, singing their old songs and sharing memories. Their last conversation returned to that first night in 1967, when a young girl from the Smoky Mountains met the king of country TV. Porter, barely able to speak, apologized for his controlling ways. Dolly's response became country music legend. "I wouldn't be who I am if you hadn't been who you were." Her last words to him were, "I will always love you." This time, it wasn't about leaving, it was about staying until the end. At his funeral, she performed their first duet, "The Last Thing on My Mind," changing the lyrics to honor their journey. "The first thing on my mind was making you proud, and that's the last thing on my mind today." Speaking of pride and loyalty in dark times, no group exemplified this more than 3 men who would become known as country music's 3 amigos. While Dolly and Porter were making headlines with their dramatic split, George Jones, Johnny Cash, and Merle Haggard were forming a brotherhood that would help them survive their deepest demons. The story starts in 1962, backstage at the Grand Ole Opry, where George Jones was too drunk to perform. As venue managers panicked, 2 fellow performers stepped in without hesitation. Johnny Cash, himself no stranger to substance struggles, and Merle Haggard, fresh out of San Quentin, didn't just cover for Jones, they protected him. They told the managers Jones had food poisoning, performed his set, and drove him home. That night formed an unspoken pact between 3 men who would become country music's most legendary support system. The bond between these 3 wasn't built on hit records or shared success. It was forged in their darkest moments. Cash was the first to extend a hand to Haggard, who'd seen him perform at San Quentin during his imprisonment. Most performers wouldn't touch an ex-con with a 10-foot pole, Haggard later recalled. "Cash didn't just touch me, he pulled me up." Instead of shunning the ex-convict, Cash invited Haggard to tour with him in 1963, giving him national exposure. What nobody knew was that Cash was fighting his own demons at the time, often performing under the influence of amphetamines. Their touring years together became legendary. They called their tour bus the Rolling Confession Booth because of the long nights spent sharing their deepest struggles. One particular night in 1965, somewhere between Memphis and Nashville, all three men swore to get clean together. They made it 3 days before Jones broke first, Cash second, and Haggard last. But the attempt itself strengthened their bond. George Jones's spiral into addiction became Nashville legend. During what became known as the Lost Weekend, which actually lasted several years, he earned the nickname No-Show Jones for missing over 50 concerts in 1979 alone. While others in the industry distanced themselves, Cash and Haggard took turns showing up at his house, sometimes finding him in desperate conditions. They'd sober him up, get him on stage, and stand behind him as he performed. The trio made a pact in 1974. If any one of them was struggling, the others would drop everything and come running. They kept hotel rooms booked in each other's names across the country, creating a network of safe houses where they could recover out of the public eye. They even shared band members, ensuring their friends' music would keep playing even during the worst times. Their most legendary intervention happened in 1980. Jones had been on a 2-week binge, and his manager couldn't find him. Cash traced him to a small bar outside Huntsville, Alabama, where Jones was performing for drinks. Instead of forcing him to leave, Cash and Haggard walked in, picked up instruments, and turned it into an impromptu concert. The 3-hour performance became known as the Night 3 Legends Played for Beer. They got Jones on Cash's tour bus afterward, where they spent the next week helping him detox while traveling between shows. Their music together was as raw as their friendship. In 1971, they rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, bringing nothing but guitars and a case of Jack Daniels. The goal was to write an album together, but instead they ended up creating what became known as the Survivor Sessions, 15 unreleased tracks about their struggles with addiction, fame, and redemption. Only 3 songs were ever officially released, but bootleg recordings still circulate among collectors. The friendship wasn't just about surviving addiction, it was about understanding each other's pain. When Cash's first wife Vivian divorced him in 1966, Jones and Haggard showed up at his house with guitars and a bottle of cola. They were both trying to stay sober at the time. The 3 sat on Cash's porch until sunrise, writing songs that would never be recorded but helped heal the Man in Black's broken heart. Their jam sessions became legendary in Nashville circles. They called them therapy sessions. No producers, no record labels, just 3 friends playing the music they loved. These often happened at Jones's farm, where they'd push aside the furniture in his living room and play until their fingers bled. June Carter Cash would cook for them, and Haggard's wife Bonnie would handle the tape recorder, capturing moments that would later become some of country music's most sought-after bootlegs. One such session in 1985 produced Heroes and Friends, though they initially had no intention of recording it commercially. The song came about after a particularly rough night when Haggard was struggling with depression. Jones started playing a melody, Cash added lyrics about friendship, and Haggard contributed the bridge. It became their unofficial anthem, though they rarely performed it in public, considering it too personal. Their support went beyond music and sobriety. When Jones faced bankruptcy in 1983, Cash quietly paid his mortgage for 6 months. When Haggard's house burned down in 1979, Jones gave him the keys to his Florida vacation home. When Cash's drug use nearly got him blacklisted in 1967, Haggard and Jones threatened to boycott 3 major venues unless they gave him another chance. They also created an underground support network for other struggling artists. Their safe houses, a network of trusted friends and venues across the country, helped countless musicians get clean. If a performer needed help, they could check into any hotel using the code phrase, "I'm a friend of John's," and within hours, one of the 3 would arrange transportation to a rehabilitation facility. The trio stood together through marriages, divorces, career highs and lows, and countless attempts at sobriety. In 1989, they recorded what would become known as the Confession Tapes, hours of conversations about their struggles, intended to help other artists dealing with addiction. These recordings remained private until 2010, when they were donated to the Country Music Hall of Fame's education department. Their influence on country music went beyond their hit records. They fought for artists' rights, often at great personal cost. When record labels tried to force artists to use specific session musicians, the trio started their own recording collective. They called it Outlaw Studios. Though it never officially existed, it was just their term for any session where artists could use their own bands. Cash's death in 2003 hit the other 2 hard. At his funeral, Jones and Haggard performed "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?", Cash's favorite gospel song, but they also fulfilled a promise they'd made decades earlier. They finished his last album project, adding their voices to tracks he'd left incomplete. The loss of Jones in 2013 left Haggard as the last of the three amigos. In his final interviews, he often spoke about their bond. "We weren't just friends," he said. "We were each other's lifelines. When you're drowning in addiction, you need someone who's been there to pull you out. We took turns being that someone for each other." Haggard carried their legacy until his own passing in 2016. His last album, Django and Jimmy with Willie Nelson, included a hidden track, a rough recording from one of those old therapy sessions, featuring all three friends singing Amazing Grace around a single microphone. As Merle Haggard wrote in his final memoir, "In country music, we talk a lot about home. Johnny and George were my home. Wherever we were, if we were together, I was home." While these three men found strength in their brotherhood, another powerful bond was forming in Nashville, one that would prove just as influential to country music's future. The year was 1961, and a young coal miner's daughter was about to meet her guardian angel in sequins. In the smoky haze of Nashville's Tally Ho Club in 1961, Loretta Lynn clutched her guitar like a shield. She had just finished her first performance and was shaking with nerves when a striking woman in a sparkly dress swept through the crowd. Patsy Cline, already a country music sensation, had heard about this new singer and decided to investigate. What happened next would create one of country music's most profound mentor relationships. "Honey, if you're gonna make it in this business, you need to stop trembling like a scared rabbit," Patsy declared, pulling up a chair. She ordered 2 Coca-Colas and spent the next 3 hours teaching Loretta everything from stage presence to dealing with handsy promoters. By the end of the night, Patsy had scribbled her phone number on a napkin. "Call me anytime, day or night. I mean it." Their first recording session together revealed the depth of their connection. Loretta was struggling with "I Fall to Pieces," a song Patsy had made famous. Instead of feeling threatened, Patsy spent 6 hours helping Loretta find her own way into the song. They tried different keys, tempos, and arrangements until 3 a.m. When the studio musicians complained about the late hour, Patsy paid them extra from her own pocket. What many don't know is how much Patsy invested in Loretta's career. She taught her stage makeup techniques during long afternoons at her kitchen table. She showed her how to walk in heels without looking like a newborn colt, as Loretta put it. Most importantly, she taught her how to command respect in an industry that often treated women as decorative accessories. The education wasn't always gentle. Once, when Loretta undersold herself for a show, Patsy stormed into the promoter's office. "You're not just paying for her voice," Patsy declared. "You're paying for her soul, and that's worth twice what you offered." She made him tear up the contract and write a new one on the spot. This lesson in self-worth became a cornerstone of Loretta's career. Their bond went far beyond music. When Loretta caught her husband Doolittle with another woman, she ran straight to Patsy's house. They stayed up all night with Patsy teaching Loretta how to make her famous hot sauce and sharing stories of her own marital struggles. That night birthed "You Ain't Woman Enough to Take My Man," with Patsy helping Loretta turn her pain into a hit song. "Don't cry about it," Patsy told her. "Write about it and make them pay to hear it." The music industry in the early 60s was especially brutal for women. Male executives would often try to pit female artists against each other, but Patsy and Loretta defied this tradition. They shared songwriters, band members, and even clothes. When Loretta couldn't afford stage outfits, Patsy gave her 3 of her own custom-made dresses. "Just add more sequins," she said. "Nobody'll know the difference." Their recording sessions became legendary among Nashville musicians. They developed a unique harmony style, with Loretta's mountain twang complementing Patsy's smooth vocals. They recorded several duets that were never released, considering them too personal for public consumption. One such recording, "Sisters," was only discovered in 2019 in a vault at Owen Bradley's studio. Every Sunday, they'd meet at Patsy's house for what they called kitchen table management. Patsy would review Loretta's contracts, schedule, and song choices, teaching her the business side of music. "Looking pretty and singing pretty ain't enough," Patsy would say. "You gotta know your worth in dollars and cents." These lessons helped Loretta become one of the first female artists to negotiate her own publishing rights. Their last conversation happened just days before Patsy's fatal plane crash. They talked for hours about Loretta's upcoming album, their kids, and their dreams for the future. Patsy had just heard Loretta's new song, "Success," and insisted she release it as her next single. "You've got something special, honey," Patsy said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." They made plans to tour together that summer, with Patsy joking that they'd need a bigger bus for all their sequined dresses. The news of Patsy's crash on March 5th, 1963 hit Loretta like a physical blow. She was in her kitchen making breakfast when she heard it on the radio. The eggs she was cooking burned black as she stood frozen, clutching the counter. For weeks after, she would dial Patsy's number at 2 a.m. out of habit, forgetting she was gone. Her grief manifested in unexpected ways. She began collecting every recording of Patsy's voice she could find, often staying up all night listening to them on repeat. She took over Patsy's tradition of mentoring young female artists, telling them the same lessons she'd learned at that kitchen table. When a young Tanya Tucker was being pressured to change her sound in 1972, Loretta stepped in just as Patsy had done for her. Unknown to many, Loretta kept a private ritual for decades. Before every performance, she would touch a sequin that had fallen from one of Patsy's dresses, which she kept in a small locket. "It's like having her there," Loretta would say, telling me to stand tall and sing proud. The loss transformed Loretta's music. Her next album, recorded just months after Patsy's death, showed a new depth and maturity. Songs like Wine, Women, and Song, and Blue Kentucky Girl carried echoes of Patsy's influence, but with Loretta's distinctive stamp. As Owen Bradley noted, it was like watching someone transform from a student to a master overnight. Their friendship changed Nashville's culture forever. Before Patsy and Loretta, female artists rarely collaborated or supported each other publicly. After their example, a new tradition emerged. Artists like Tammy Wynette and Dolly Parton began actively mentoring newcomers. They called it Patsy's Legacy, though the name was rarely used publicly. The impact rippled through generations. When Barbara Mandrell faced criticism for her bold style in the 1970s, Loretta shared Patsy's words: "If they're talking about you, they're thinking about you." When Reba McEntire struggled with stage fright early in her career, Loretta passed on Patsy's breathing techniques and confidence exercises. In 1977, Loretta finally fulfilled a promise she'd made to Patsy. She opened a small museum in Hurricane Mills, Tennessee, dedicating a room to female country artists who helped others. Patsy's sequined dress from their first meeting took center stage. The room became known as the Sisterhood Suite, though its real significance was known only to those who understood its origins. As Loretta wrote in her memoir, "Patsy didn't just teach me about music, she taught me how to be a strong woman in a man's world. That's worth more than all the hit records in the world. She showed me that success means nothing if you don't reach back and help the ones coming up behind you." Even in her final years, Loretta kept discovering new aspects of Patsy's influence. In 2016, she found an old notebook where Patsy had written advice about songwriting. The last page read, "Remember, honey, we're not just making music, we're making history. Make it count." Speaking of making history, while these legendary women were creating their own support system, another powerful partnership was reshaping country music's sound. In the control rooms and recording studios of Music Row, two men were about to revolutionize the way country music was produced. In 1952, a young guitarist named Chet Atkins sat in RCA's Studio B, watching Jim Reeves struggle with his 8th take of Mexican Joe. The traditional honky-tonk arrangement wasn't working, and frustration filled the room. That's when Atkins made a suggestion that would change country music forever. "What if we removed the fiddle and steel guitar?" The other musicians looked at him like he'd suggested removing their souls, but Reeves, desperate for a hit, agreed to try. They stripped away the traditional country instruments, added subtle strings, and softened the percussion. The result wasn't just a hit, it became the blueprint for what would be known as the Nashville sound. This moment marked the beginning of a decade-long partnership between two men who saw country music's future differently than anyone else. Chet Atkins, the guitar virtuoso turned producer, and Jim Reeves, the velvet voice singer, became more than collaborators. They became brothers in a musical revolution. Their partnership started contentiously. When RCA first paired them, Reeves was skeptical of Atkins' innovative ideas. "You're trying to make country music for people who don't like country music," he accused. Atkins replied, "I'm trying to make country music for people who don't know they like country music yet." The chemistry between them transformed during a late-night session in 1953. Frustrated with a particular song, they sent the band home and spent hours experimenting with different sounds. Using just Reeves' voice and Atkins' guitar, they created an intimate sound that would become their signature. This session produced "I'm Hurtin' Inside," a song that proved country music could be sophisticated without losing its soul. Their unconventional methods raised eyebrows in conservative Nashville. When Atkins suggested using the Anita Kerr singers for backing vocals instead of traditional country harmonies, industry veterans predicted disaster. But Reeves trusted his partner's instincts. The resulting recordings, including Four Walls and He'll Have to Go, proved that country music could compete with pop on its own terms. The duo's work ethic was legendary. They would often spend 18-hour days in the studio perfecting a single vocal track. Reeves would sing a song 30 times if necessary, while Atkins meticulously crafted the arrangements. Their perfectionism drove musicians crazy, but the results were undeniable. As one session player noted, they weren't making records, they were making history. Beyond the studio, their friendship deepened through shared struggles. When Reeves faced backlash from country purists, Atkins defended him publicly and privately. When Atkins doubted his direction as a producer, Reeves convinced him to keep pushing boundaries. They shared Sunday dinners, family vacations, and late-night songwriting sessions that often had nothing to do with their recording schedule. Their most innovative work came in 1960 with the album He'll Have to Go. Atkins introduced the concept of slip note piano playing, brought in by session pianist Floyd Kramer, while Reeves perfected his velvet voice technique of singing closer to the microphone. The album's production quality was so superior that other labels would bring their engineers to Studio B just to study its sound. The partnership was tragically cut short in 1964 when Reeves died in a plane crash. Atkins was devastated but determined to honor their shared vision. He continued refining the Nashville sound, working with artists like Ray Price and Roger Miller, always asking himself, what would Jim say about this? Their legacy transformed country music's commercial appeal. The Nashville sound they created helped country music reach suburban audiences and compete on mainstream radio. As Atkins often said, Jim and I didn't want to change country music. We wanted to add to it. The techniques they pioneered remain industry standards today. Their use of the isolation booth for vocals, their method of recording rhythm sections, and their approach to mixing became the foundation of modern country production. But more than their technical innovations, they proved that true friendship could survive artistic revolution. As the groundwork they laid continued to influence country music, their story became a testament to the power of trust between artists and producers. The Nashville sound wasn't just built on technical innovation, it was built on the unshakable bond between two men who dared to dream bigger than their era. In Nashville's glittering world of rhinestones and gold records, loyalty often came with a hefty price tag. Beyond the public displays of friendship, country music's greatest bonds were tested in moments when careers, fortunes, and reputations hung in the balance. When Willie Nelson faced a $32 million IRS bill in 1990, he discovered who his real friends were. Waylon Jennings offered to sell his publishing rights, his most valuable asset, to help pay the debt. Though Willie declined, this gesture demonstrated how country music's legendary friendships transcended business interests. The incident inspired Waylon's lesser-known song, The Devil's Right-Hand Man, about choosing friendship over fortune. Dolly Parton's quiet support of Porter Wagoner went beyond their public reconciliation. When Porter faced bankruptcy, Dolly didn't just buy his publishing catalog, she continued paying his band members salaries for 2 years, ensuring they wouldn't leave him when he needed them most. She did this anonymously, and the truth only emerged after Porter's death. Some acts of loyalty came at an even steeper price. When George Jones was at his lowest, blacklisted from major venues due to his notorious no-show reputation, Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard put their own careers on the line. They refused to play any venue that wouldn't book Jones, effectively forcing promoters to give him another chance. This stance cost them several lucrative contracts, but as Cash said, some things matter more than money. The cost wasn't always measured in dollars. When Loretta Lynn's husband tried to stop her from performing in 1973, Patsy Cline's widower, Charlie Dick, intervened. He shared private letters Patsy had written about Loretta's talent, convincing Doolittle Lynn that stopping her would be a tragedy. This intervention saved Loretta's career, but strained the relationship between the two men permanently. Behind the scenes, these bonds often required unprecedented sacrifices. When Chet Atkins was criticized for destroying traditional country music with the Nashville sound, Jim Reeves risked his fan base by publicly defending him. "If this is destruction," Reeves declared at a pivotal CMA meeting, "then let's tear it all down and build it better." The statement cost him his core audience, but cemented a partnership that would revolutionize country music. Perhaps the most powerful example came in 1980, when Waylon Jennings, Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Johnny Cash turned down $1 million tour offer because the promoter wouldn't include Merle Haggard, who was struggling with addiction at the time. Instead, they created the Survivors Tour, splitting the significantly smaller profits 4 ways. As Waylon noted, in country music, we rise together or we don't rise at all. These friendships also influenced the next generation. When young artists like Vern Gosdin and Keith Whitley faced their own demons in the late 80s, they found support through the networks built by their predecessors. The Safe Houses system, started by Jones, Cash, and Haggard, saved countless careers and lives. Today, these stories of friendship and sacrifice remain country music's hidden foundation. While the industry celebrates record sales and awards, its true legacy lies in moments when artists chose loyalty over success, friendship over fortune, and integrity over image. As Willie Nelson once said, in Nashville, a friend isn't someone who stands by you when you're right. It's someone who stands by you when you're wrong, broke, and out of options. That's when you learn what loyalty really costs.